A 28-year-old woman arrived at Iron Creek Ranch carrying nothing but a dented pie pan, a handwritten recipe book, and 43 cents, and the entire town of Dry Hollow laughed at her. They said she was too big, too plain, too poor to survive a single Montana winter. They said she'd be gone before the first frost. They were wrong about everything. This is the story of Mabel Rowan, the woman nobody wanted, who walked into a broken home, a hostile community, and a legal war she didn't start, and refused to lose any of it. Watch until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Mabel Rowan buried her mother, the sky over Dry Hollow was the color of a bruise. Not a poetic bruise, not the kind writers romanticize in purple prose. The actual color of one, yellowish at the edges, deep and angry at the center. The kind of sky that made experienced ranchers squint and check their fence lines before anything else. It was the third week of July, 1889, and Montana was in the middle of a dry stretch that had turned the creek beds to pale, cracked mud and the grass to something closer to straw than feed. Mabel noticed the sky the way she noticed most things, practically, without ceremony. Rain might be coming. That meant the road west would turn to mud by afternoon, which meant if she was going to make it to Iron Creek Ranch before dark, she needed to leave within the hour. She stood at the edge of the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, a place she wasn't even a member of, but the Reverend had been decent enough to allow the burial since the county plot charged $3 she didn't have. She'd paid him in a jar of preserved peaches and a loaf of bread, which he'd accepted without making her feel the exchange was shameful. She was grateful for that. There weren't many people in Dry Hollow who'd extended her that particular courtesy lately. Her mother's grave was marked with a flat stone Mabel had carried from the creek bed herself, dragging it on a piece of burlap through 200 yards of scrubland. She'd carved the name with a nail and a hammer borrowed from the livery stable. Ruth Rowan, 1841 to 1889. She did what she could. It wasn't a beautiful epitaph, but it was honest, and Ruth Rowan had always valued honesty over beauty, a preference that had made her life considerably harder than it needed to be, and that Mabel had inherited along with the recipe book, the pie pan, and the 43 cents currently wrapped in a handkerchief inside her coat pocket. She stood there for maybe 3 minutes. She'd cried already, the night before, sitting alone in the empty room they'd shared above the tannery, surrounded by her mother's few possessions and the smell of lye and leather that had soaked into the walls over 4 years of living there. She'd cried until there was nothing left. And then she'd folded the grief up like a piece of laundry and put it somewhere manageable. Because there were things to do, and a road to walk and crying on a public street in Dry Hollow would only give people something to say. People in Dry Hollow already had plenty to say about Mabel Rowan. She picked up her bundle, the recipe book wrapped in oilcloth, the pie pan nested inside a flour sack along with a change of clothes, a small knife, and a heel of bread. And she started walking west. The posting had been on the board outside the general store for 11 days before Mabel finally answered it. She'd walked past it every morning on her way to the tannery, where she'd been picking up piecework since her mother got sick, sorting and stacking hides for 3 cents a bundle, which was work that left her hands cracked and smelling wrong for days after. She'd read the notice each time without stopping, because stopping would have meant people seeing her consider it, and in a town like Dry Hollow, consideration was the same as admission. Wanted? Kitchen worker. Iron Creek Ranch, 6 miles west on the Bitterroot Road. Room and meals provided. Inquire at the Hawthorne property or send word through the Dry Hollow Post. E. Hawthorne, proprietor. No wage listed. That was the first thing she'd noticed. Either the man was cheap, or he expected whoever answered to negotiate, and neither option was particularly encouraging. The second thing she'd noticed was that the posting had been up for 11 days without being answered, which in a territory full of people who needed work meant something about either the ranch or the man running it, or both. She'd asked around carefully, the way she'd learned to ask things in Dry Hollow, which was indirectly and only of people who owed her a small enough favor that they might be honest. What she'd learned: Elias Hawthorne was 41 years old, widowed 3 years prior when his wife Clara died of a fever that had swept through the valley the winter of 1886. He had 2 daughters, 12 and 8, and a cattle operation that had been struggling since Clara died, not because the land was bad or the herd was poor, but because Elias Hawthorne had, by most accounts, simply stopped paying attention to things that weren't the herd. The house had gone unmanaged. The kitchen had gone unmanaged. Two previous women hired for the position had left within a month each. One because the isolation was worse than she'd expected, and one for reasons nobody was entirely clear on, but that involved raised voices and a slammed door that the postmaster's wife had witnessed personally and described in considerable detail to anyone who'd listen. This was not by any measure an appealing situation, but Mabel was 28 years old, had 43 cents, no mother, no permanent housing as of the previous week when the tannery owner had mentioned he needed the room back for his wife's sister, and no prospects in Dry Hollow that didn't involve more piecework at wages that were barely keeping her fed. She had a talent for cooking, a real one, not the modest kind women claimed and then failed to demonstrate, but the kind that had made her mother's kitchen the unofficial gathering place of every neighborhood they'd ever lived in, the kind built on understanding food at a structural level, knowing why a crust held or didn't, why a braise needed acid, why bread rose better on certain mornings than others. She answered the posting. The man at the post office counter had looked at her with an expression she'd become fluent in reading over the course of her life, the specific combination of surprise and poorly concealed doubt that people deployed when a woman of her size attempted to do something they hadn't anticipated. "Iron Creek," he'd said. "You sure about that?" "I wrote the letter already," she said. "I just need it to go out today. Hawthorne's a difficult man. That's his business. His last two kitchen workers didn't stay." "I'm not his last two kitchen workers." The man had looked at her for a moment longer, not unkindly exactly, but in the way of someone deciding whether to continue the conversation. And then he'd taken her letter and charged her 2 cents for the post. 3 days later, a reply came back. 4 words, in handwriting so angular and abbreviated, it looked like the man had been interrupted twice while writing it. "Come Monday, E. Hawthorne." It was not an enthusiastic response, but it wasn't a no. 6 miles on the Bitterroot Road in July, with the sky still threatening and the bundle getting heavier, was not a pleasant walk. Mabel had made it worse for herself by leaving later than intended. She'd stopped to return the borrowed hammer to the livery stable, and the conversation had taken longer than expected because Hank Drury, who ran the livery, was a talker, and he'd wanted to know where she was going, and once she'd told him the information had spread the way, information always spread in Dry Hollow, immediately and with embellishment. She'd passed 2 women from the dry goods store on her way out of town. They'd been standing near the water trough, not even pretending to be doing anything else. "Iron Creek?" the taller one said. Her name was Mrs. Pierce, and she was the kind of woman who served on every committee and ran every event and made certain everyone understood exactly how much effort that required. "You're going to work for Elias Hawthorne?" "That's right," Mabel said, and kept walking. "You know he's already run off 2 women." "I heard. That kitchen is in a state, from what people say. 3 years of neglect." Mrs. Pierce paused, and Mabel could hear the calculation in the pause, the weighing of whether the next observation was worth saying aloud. Apparently it was. "And it's ranch work, it's physical." Mabel stopped. She turned around. Mrs. Pierce had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't retract the implication. She didn't need to. They both understood what she meant. A woman your size, attempting physical labor, in a difficult posting. You're going to embarrass yourself. "I've been doing physical work since I was 14 years old," Mabel said. "I've hauled water and cut wood and carried hides in a tannery 6 days a week for the last 8 months. I expect I'll manage a kitchen." She turned back around and kept walking. Behind her, she heard the other woman, Mrs. Pierce's companion, whose name she didn't know, say something in a low voice, and then the sound of both of them laughing. It was a specific kind of laughter, the kind that assumed it wouldn't be overheard, or that, if it was, the person hearing it didn't matter enough to worry about. Mabel added it to a private account she'd been keeping since she was old enough to understand that people kept those kinds of accounts, whether they admitted to it or not, and she walked on. Iron Creek Ranch appeared gradually, the way things appeared in flat country, as a collection of shapes resolving out of the heat haze, becoming more specific the closer she got. First the windmill, motionless in the dead afternoon air, then the outline of a barn, then a second outbuilding, then the house itself. 2 stories, wood frame, a covered porch running the length of the front, the whole thing wearing the particular faded gray look of structures that had been built with care and then gradually let go. The yard was not well maintained. That was the first thing she registered, not disastrously. The fences were intact, the stock pen looked functional, there was evidence of recent work on the barn's east wall. But the area closest to the house had the look of a space that was used without being tended. A rusted piece of equipment near the fence line. A rain barrel with a cracked stave leaking slowly into the dirt. A kitchen garden that had been planted, judging by the ghosts of the rows, but not kept up. The beds gone mostly to weeds with a few struggling plants pushing through regardless. Someone had planted that garden and then stopped caring for it. She knew the feeling. She pushed the front gate open. It stuck halfway, and she had to lift it slightly to get it past the settling, and walked up to the house. She knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. Quick ones, lighter than a grown man's. The door opened 3 inches and a face appeared in the gap. A girl, maybe 8 years old, with brown hair that hadn't been properly brushed in what looked like several days, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, green with a thread of gray through it. Studying Mabel with the direct, unguarded assessment that children were capable of before they learned to hide it. "You're big," the girl said. "I am," Mabel agreed. "Are you the new kitchen lady?" "That's what I'm here to find out. Is your father home?" The girl considered this. "He's in the barn. He said to come back after supper, but supper's not for—" She stopped, apparently recalculating. "I don't know when supper is. We don't always have it at the same time." "What's your name?" "Elsie. Elsie Marie Hawthorne." "Elsie Marie. That's a good name. I'm Mabel Rowan." She paused. "Could you tell your father I'm here?" Elsie looked at her for another moment, still that unfiltered, curious assessment. And then she pulled the door fully open, turned, and yelled, "June! June! The kitchen lady is here, and she's really big." From somewhere deeper in the house, a tired-sounding voice called back, "I can hear you, Elsie. I'm not in the barn." June Hawthorne was 12, going on something considerably older. She came down the stairs with the contained, careful bearing of a child who had been managing more than a child should for long enough that it had become her default posture. And she looked at Mabel the way someone looked at a piece of equipment they were considering purchasing but had been burned before on similar items. "My father's in the barn," she said. Her tone was polite and completely flat, the way tone was when a person had decided not to invest in something before they knew whether it was worth investing in. "So I heard. He might not come in for a while. He said—" She stopped. Whatever her father had said, she'd apparently decided it wasn't helpful to share. "Do you want to wait on the porch?" "I'd rather see the kitchen, if that's all right." June looked at her. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite surprise, not quite wariness, something in between. "Why?" "Because it's the part of the job I'll be doing. Makes sense to look at it before I decide whether to stay." Another pause. Then June stepped back from the door and gestured her in. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was, as the Dry Hollow gossip had suggested, a state, not filthy. Mabel had half expected filthy, and it wasn't that. It was neglected. There was a difference. Filthy meant no one cared. Neglected meant someone had cared once and then stopped. And the evidence of that former caring was still visible under the accumulated disorder. The good quality cast iron stove, cold now, that had been properly seasoned at some point and would be again with work. The pine work table, scarred and uneven, that had been scrubbed regularly once and still had the grain memory of it. The preserves on the pantry shelf, the older ones dusty, a few of them clouded in ways that meant she'd be throwing them out, but some of them still good. The kitchen garden visible through the rear window, barely alive but not entirely dead. There were dishes stacked but not washed. A pot on the stove with the remnants of something that had been there long enough to harden at the edges. The floor needed sweeping. The wood box was half empty. Mabel set her bundle down on the work table and looked at all of it with the particular kind of attention she'd learned from her mother. Not the attention of someone cataloging failures, but the attention of someone calculating what could be salvaged, and in what order. "It's been like this for a while," June said from the doorway. She'd followed without Mabel asking her to, which meant she wanted to see how Mabel reacted. "How long is a while?" "Since Mrs. Cooper left, that was 6 months ago." "And before her?" "Mrs. Avery. But she only stayed 3 weeks." June paused. Before that, we had... She stopped. The sentence she'd started had a word in it that Mabel could guess. Mother. And June had pulled it back, not with grief exactly, but with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned that saying certain words in casual conversation made things harder, not easier. It's been a while, she said again, simply. I see. My father isn't... June started, then stopped again. You don't have to explain him to me, Mabel said. I'll meet him myself. She found a bucket, located the water pump in the yard, and started on the dishes. Mom. Elias Hawthorne came in from the barn an hour later. Mabel heard him before she saw him. The specific sound of boots on a porch being knocked clean against the step, and then the back door, which opened directly into the kitchen, came open. He stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of built-up, practical bulk that came from actual work rather than from size. Lean in the face, weathered, with dark hair going gray early at the temples, and eyes that were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He was wearing work clothes that had been good once and were now just functional, and he had the look of a man who had gotten dressed that morning without looking in a mirror, which was probably accurate. He looked at Mabel, then at the stack of clean dishes drying on the cloth beside the basin, then at the kitchen, which was visibly different than it had been 2 hours ago. The floor swept, the pot removed and soaking outside, the stove laid with fresh wood ready to light, the work table cleared. You're the woman who answered the post, he said. Mabel Rowan. Hawthorne. He didn't offer his hand. She noticed that. Not rudeness exactly, more the automatic omission of a man who had been mostly alone for long enough that social formalities had gotten rusty. I expected you Monday. Today is Monday. He blinked. Then he looked at the window, as if confirming the light, as if he'd genuinely lost track. Is it? Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck. It was not, she thought, a calculating gesture. It was just a man recalibrating. I should have been here earlier. I lost track. The girls were here. Something moved in his face when she said that. A faint, complicated tension around the eyes. The kind that came from a man who knew he should have been somewhere and wasn't, and had that knowledge arrive with more weight than a simple scheduling oversight. He looked toward the hallway for a moment, then back at her. They behaved themselves? They were fine. June showed me the kitchen. Elsie informed me I was large. His expression did something unexpected. For just a moment, half a second, maybe less, the tiredness in his face shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. A brief involuntary flicker that told her there was a person in there underneath the weathered-down exterior, somewhere. That sounds like Elsie, he said. She's right, for the record. He looked at her again, differently this time, with a reassessment in it that she couldn't entirely read. Then he looked at the kitchen again. You cleaned. I'm going to clean more. The pantry needs sorting, and there are about 6 preserves I'll need to throw out, but the rest of the stock is in reasonable shape. The stove's good. It just needs use. The kitchen garden's not dead yet. I can put it back. He was quiet for a moment. The last woman I hired, Mrs. Avery, she said the garden was beyond saving. It isn't. She also said the stove was warped. It isn't. Another pause. He had the manner of a man deciding something, which she respected. People who decided carefully were harder to deal with in the short term, but more reliable in the long term. She waited, because pushing would have been wrong, and she knew it. The arrangement is room and meals, he said. The room is on the 2nd floor, end of the hall. It's small. The work is the kitchen and the household. I don't need somebody running things. I just need the house functional. I understand. And I'm not... He stopped. He seemed to be working toward something he wasn't quite sure how to phrase. This isn't a social arrangement. I'm not looking for... He stopped again. I'm here to work, Mabel said. That's all. He nodded. There was something in his face she couldn't name. Not relief exactly, but something like it. The specific expression of a person who had been braced for a conversation to go badly and had it go, if not well, at least simply. I'll show you the room, he said. The room was, as advertised, small. A single bed, a washstand, a narrow window looking out over the kitchen garden, and the flat plain beyond. The mattress was dusty and would need airing. The washstand had a crack in the basin. There was a hook on the door for clothes and a single shelf on the wall with 3 books on it that someone had left, and apparently no one had moved. A farming almanac, a book of pressed flowers whose identity she couldn't immediately determine, and a tattered novel with no cover. She set her bundle down on the bed and looked at the window. The sky had clouded over properly now. Whatever storm had been threatening all day was making its intentions known, and the kitchen garden below was visible, a scraggy rectangle of battered earth that had, she could see more clearly from up here, the bones of something that had been carefully laid out once. Someone had known what they were doing with that garden. The rows were in the right positions for the sun. The spacing was considered. It hadn't been a kitchen garden that happened accidentally. It had been planned by someone who thought about food with more than practical interest. She thought about Clara Hawthorne, about whom she knew almost nothing, and what she might have been like, and whether it was strange or appropriate to feel, standing in that small room with the cracked basin and the anonymous books, something close to kinship with a person she'd never meet. Then she turned around and started airing the mattress. She made supper that night from what was in the pantry: a bean soup with salt pork, a pan of cornbread with the last of the flour, and preserved peaches from one of the jars that was still good. Nothing complicated, nothing that announced itself. She set the table for 4 because there were 4 people in the house, which apparently had not been the default arrangement for some time. When Elias came in from washing up and found the table set that way, he stopped at the kitchen doorway, the same way he'd stopped when he'd found the dishes done. That recalibrating pause. The same look of something shifted unexpectedly. "Do the girls eat here?" Mabel asked, though she already knew the answer from what she'd seen. He glanced toward the hall. "Usually they eat earlier. In the kitchen." "Where do you eat?" A pause. "In the office." "You can still do that," she said. "I just set out 4 places in case." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he sat down at the table. Elsie, who had been hovering in the hallway with the undisguised strategic positioning of an 8-year-old conducting surveillance, materialized at her place with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this development. June came more slowly, with her careful posture and her watchful eyes, and she sat down across from Mabel and looked at the food, and then looked at Mabel and didn't say anything. "It's just soup," Mabel said. "I can see that," June said. "And cornbread. I know what cornbread is." "June," Elias said in a tone that was automatic rather than engaged, the tone of a parent who says a child's name as a general-purpose break without necessarily focusing on what requires the break. "I'm not doing anything," June said. "She's fine," Mabel said. "Eat while it's warm." The soup was good. She didn't apologize for it or announce it. It was just good because she'd made it right. The cornbread had a crust on it the way cornbread should when the pan was properly heated, and she'd put a small amount of the preserved peaches out in a dish, not as dessert exactly, just as something sweet at the end of a meal, which was a thing she'd learned from her mother mattered more than its simplicity suggested. Elsie ate with the focused efficiency of a child who was actually hungry and had been for a while. June ate more carefully, watching the table with those assessing eyes, and periodically watching Mabel. Elias ate without comment, which could have meant anything. It was not a warm meal in the storybook sense. No one laughed. No one made conversation that mattered. The silences were long and not entirely comfortable, but it was 4 people at a table, and the food was good, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and nobody ate alone. Mabel thought that was enough. For a first night, it was enough. After supper, June helped her clear the table without being asked, which Mabel noted but didn't remark on. "The soup was decent," June said, while they were stacking the dishes. Coming from June, Mabel had already assessed decent was not a modest compliment. "Thank you," she said. June scraped a dish. "Mrs. Cooper made everything taste like it had been punished," she said, to no one in particular. Mabel thought about that for a moment. "That's a good way to put it. I can put things well when I want to." "I can tell." June scraped another dish. Outside, the storm had arrived properly. Rain on the roof, the good heavy kind that the ground needed, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like food and wood smoke. "I'm not going to be friendly right away," June said, "just so you know. It's not about you." "That's all right. The last 2 women both tried to make us like them immediately. It seemed like they needed it more than we did. Mabel looked at her sideways. You're 12? Yes. You think like you're older. People say that. June's voice was neutral, not flattered, not bothered. It's not a compliment, actually. Mabel considered that. No, she said. I don't suppose it is. They finished the dishes in silence after that, and outside the rain came down hard and steady, and the storm moved through, and in the morning the kitchen garden would be wet, and the air would smell like turned earth, and there would be, depending on how things went, either more days like this one or the quiet drive back to Dry Hollow, and whatever came after. Mabel washed her hands at the basin, dried them on the cloth, and looked out the window at the dark where the garden was. She'd be staying. She hadn't made that decision consciously, but she'd made it somewhere during the evening, during the soup, maybe, or during June's careful declaration of non-friendship, or during the moment when Elias had looked at a table set for 4 and sat down at it without explanation. She'd made it the way she made most decisions, quietly, practically, without drama. There was work to do here. Good work, the kind that mattered, the kind that left something different than it had been. The kitchen garden, the stove, the pantry, the small, complicated household of a man who had gone inward, and 2 girls who were doing a remarkable job of managing without things children shouldn't have to manage without. She turned off the lamp and went upstairs to the small room with the cracked basin and the anonymous books. The mattress, once aired, was decent. Outside, the rain continued and the garden drank it up, and somewhere in the dark of the house, Elsie was probably already asleep, and June was probably reading with a lamp turned low, and Elias Hawthorne was probably sitting in his office not quite working, the way grief made people sit in rooms and stare at things without seeing them, the way it had taken Mabel's mother at the end too, not the dying but the distance. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the rain. She'd been laughed at today. She'd walked 6 miles with 43 cents and a pie pan, and she'd been publicly assessed and found wanting by women who didn't know her and wouldn't trouble themselves to. She'd walked into a house full of people who needed things they couldn't ask for, run by a man who had spent 3 years closing down around his own grief. None of that was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, not even close. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would fix the kitchen garden. She'd start with the herbs. They were hardier, and once the herbs were in, the rest would follow. She'd have to find out what the ranch hands ate and when, and whether there was a system to the food ordering or if it had been improvised for the last 3 years. And she'd need to check the condition of the root cellar. And there was the matter of the stovepipe, which she'd noticed was slightly misaligned and would need addressing before proper winter cooking started. Plenty of work. Good work. She slept. She woke before dawn because she'd always woken before dawn. It was one of those habits that came from a childhood where mornings were often the only time that was wholly yours before everything else claimed the day. The house was silent. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, and the air coming through the cracked window was clean and cool and smelled like the sage that grew in the scrubland behind the property. She dressed in the dark, the way she'd dressed in rented rooms her whole life, without fumbling. Picked up her boots. Carried them downstairs to put on at the bottom, because she wasn't going to wake the girls at 5 in the morning if she could help it. The kitchen had held the warmth from the stove through the night. She laid fresh wood, got the fire going, and put the kettle on. Found the coffee, there was some, not much, and measured it carefully. Then she went out through the back door to look at the kitchen garden in the early light. Up close, in the gray morning before the sun properly cleared the horizon, it was in worse shape than it had looked from the window. The weeds had gotten into everything. The soil was compacted in places from the rain pooling where the drainage was blocked. A section of the border had been pushed in by something, deer probably, and several of the beds were contaminated with grass roots that would need to come out entirely before anything useful could go in. But the bones were there. Good bones. The layout was smart, thought through by someone who'd understood which plants needed sun and which needed partial shade, which needed to be near the water source, and which were drought-tolerant enough to be at a distance. The garden wasn't random. It had been designed. She crouched down at the edge of one bed and turned over a handful of soil. Good dark earth underneath the crust. Not depleted. "You're up early." She turned. Elias was standing at the back door in work clothes, a cup of coffee in his hand. He'd found the pot she'd left warming, and he was looking at her in the garden with an expression she couldn't immediately decode. "I like mornings," she said. He looked at the garden. Something happened in his face, brief, controlled, the same kind of controlled as June's pulling back of certain words. Claire's garden, he said. Not to her exactly, just out loud. I know, Mabel said. I can tell someone who knew what they were doing planted it. He was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. The sky was lightening at the edges, the sage and scrubland beginning to emerge from the dark. It doesn't have to be exactly what it was, Mabel said carefully. No, he said. His voice was flat, but not hostile. Just careful, the way people were careful with certain subjects. But the layout is good. It'd be a shame to let it go entirely. He didn't answer that. He looked at the garden for another moment, then back at the horizon. Then he said, I've got fencing to check on the north side. I'll be out until midday. All right. The girls will want breakfast by 7. I know. He nodded once, set his empty cup on the back step, and walked off toward the barn. Mabel turned back to the garden. She found a tool shed behind the woodpile, sorted through the available implements, selected a good hoe and a spade, and started at the far corner, where the weeds were worst and where, if she cleared far enough in, she might find the lavender she thought she'd spotted from the window. She was still clearing when the sun came fully up. She was still clearing when she heard Elsie's voice from the kitchen above her, calling for June, and June's patient, tired reply, and the sound of the house waking up around the day's work. She straightened her back, wiped her hands on her trousers, and went inside to make breakfast. It was the second day. The work was just beginning. The lavender was alive. She'd found it on the 4th morning, under a mat of crabgrass so thick she'd almost given up on that corner of the garden entirely. But she'd kept pulling, the way she kept at most things, not with passion, just with persistence. And there it was. 4 plants, gnarled and woody at the base, but green at the tips. The kind of green that meant stubborn survival rather than flourishing, which was its own category of impressive. She'd cleared around them carefully, broken up the compacted soil, and left them to the sun without making a fuss about it. That was the 3rd week of July. By the middle of August, the lavender had put out new growth, and the kitchen garden was beginning to look like something again. It wasn't the only thing that had changed. The changes at Iron Creek happened the way most real changes happened, gradually, with setbacks, without any single moment where you could point and say, there, that's when it turned. The kitchen was functional now, reliably, which meant meals appeared at consistent times, which meant the shape of the day had an architecture it hadn't had before. Breakfast at 7, dinner at noon when Elias came in from the range, supper at 6. Not ceremonial, Mabel didn't go in for ceremony, but regular, the way a heartbeat was regular, something the body counted on without having to think about it. Elsie adapted to this immediately and completely, the way 8-year-olds adapted to routines that involved food, with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who had been quietly hungry for a long time and was relieved not to be anymore. She started appearing in the kitchen before meals rather than at them, sitting on the high stool near the work table and talking with the unfiltered expansiveness of a child who had found an audience willing to actually listen. June took longer. June always took longer. But somewhere around the end of the 1st month, Mabel had looked up from the bread she was making to find June sitting at the kitchen table with a book, not talking, not asking for anything, just present. And she'd understood that for June, that was the equivalent of a declaration. Elias was a different kind of complicated. He was not a difficult man exactly. He was a closed one. There was a difference, though living with the result was sometimes similar. He said what was needed and not much more. He was reliable in the practical sense. The fences got checked, the herd got managed, the ranch hands got paid on time. But he moved through the house the way someone moved through a space they were staying in temporarily, carefully, without leaving much of himself on the surfaces. Mabel had noticed that he never sat in the main room in the evenings. He went to his office or he went to the barn, and he stayed there until the house was quiet. She didn't push. She'd told him she wasn't there for social arrangements, and she meant it. And she'd meant it not as a strategy, but as a genuine statement of what she was. A practical woman who understood the difference between what she was hired to do and what she was not hired to do. But she was observant. She couldn't help that. And what she observed over those first weeks was a man doing the work of surviving grief by making himself smaller and smaller inside it, contracting around it, until the grief was the largest thing in any room he occupied, and he was the smaller thing arranged around it. She didn't say any of this. but she noticed. What she did instead was make the kitchen a place where it was possible to be without requiring anything of the person being there. She kept it warm. She kept it smelling like things that were good. Bread, coffee in the mornings, whatever was on the stove. She didn't require conversation. She didn't require appreciation. She didn't perform cheerfulness, which was its own form of demand, the expectation that others would mirror it back. She just cooked and worked and let the house become habitable. One evening, in the third week of August, Elias came into the kitchen at a strange hour, not supper time, not morning, and stood near the stove with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who had arrived somewhere without quite knowing why. Mabel was working on a pie. She'd been developing a new variation on her mother's apple recipe, adjusting the spice ratios, and she was at the stage where she needed to keep moving, or the crust would get too warm. "You don't have to stay in the office every night," she said, without looking up. A pause. "I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not making an invitation," she said. "I'm just noting that the kitchen is here. It's warm. There's coffee left if you want it." She kept her hands moving on the pastry. "Or not. Up to you." He stood there for another moment. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, not near her, not in the way that wanted something from her, just in the same room. He sat there for about 20 minutes. He didn't talk, and neither did she. He drank his coffee, and she finished the pie and put it in the oven, and eventually he said goodnight and went back to his office. But he came back the next night, and the one after that. By September, it had become a pattern, not acknowledged, not discussed, just the quiet gravity of a warm room with good things in it, pulling at a man who had been cold for a long time. The trouble started, as trouble in small communities usually did, at a social occasion. The Dry Hollow Harvest Gathering was held every September in the field behind the grain exchange, a half-social, half-functional event where ranching families came together to deal with collective business and then stayed for the supper and music afterward. Elias hadn't attended in 2 years. He decided to go this year, and his reason for going was, Mabel understood, complicated in ways that had something to do with the girls and something to do with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided, quietly, to start re-engaging with the world. He didn't ask Mabel to come. She didn't expect him to. She had no standing to attend. She was hired staff, and she wasn't sure she wanted to, given the last interaction she'd had with Dry Hollow's social layer on the road out of town. But she needed supplies, and the grain exchange was the only place to get them, and the gathering was the one day the exchange ran a discount sale on bulk flour. So she went, separately, on foot, and she bought her flour and her salt and the lamp oil she needed, and she was loading it into the wagon she'd borrowed from the ranch when she heard her name from across the yard. She turned. Victor Langford was not a physically imposing man. This was something people always mentioned about him, slightly surprised. They expected someone named Victor Langford, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had been doing business in the territory for 25 years, to be large and loud and visually authoritative. He was not. He was medium height, narrow through the shoulders, with a precisely trimmed beard going white and pale eyes that were quiet and watchful in the way of someone who had learned long ago that listening was more useful than talking. He wore good clothes without ostentation. He smiled with the ease of a man who had smiled at difficult moments for decades. He walked toward her with the air of someone paying a social call. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Victor Langford. I run the Double Bar L, east of town." "I know who you are," Mabel said. "Good." He seemed neither flattered nor bothered by that. "Then you know I'm an important neighbor to Iron Creek." He paused. "I'd like to be a helpful one if I can." Mabel finished loading the sack of flour. "What can I do for you, Mr. Langford?" "I wanted to offer some friendly advice," he said, "about your position." She turned and looked at him. He met her gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who had a lot of practice maintaining it. "My position," she said, "at the Hawthorne Ranch. I understand you've been there, 6 weeks now? 7? 8. 8. That's longer than either of the previous women managed." He said it pleasantly, with nothing in his tone that was overtly threatening. "Elias has had a difficult time of it since Clara passed. We all feel for him. The community does." "I'm sure it does, which is why people are concerned." His voice carried the word carefully, the way you carried something fragile across a bad floor. About the situation. A single woman in a widower's house. People notice these things. People talk. Mabel loaded the second sack. People in this community talk about everything, she said. That doesn't seem to be something anyone needs my help with. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Not anger, just a recalibration. The slight adjustment of a man moving to a different approach. I'm thinking of your reputation, he said. A woman in your circumstances. On her own, without family connections in the territory, the things being said could follow you. What things? He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of reluctant disclosure, the performance of a man sharing something he'd rather not. That you've positioned yourself deliberately, that your interest in the Hawthorne household is not purely professional. Mabel looked at him steadily for a moment. The yard around them had the usual gathering noise, people talking, the grain exchange doing business, somewhere behind the equipment shed someone's horse unhappy about something. She was aware, in her peripheral vision, of at least two women she recognized from the road outside of town, watching from a distance with the careful attention of people waiting to see how something turned out. Mr. Langford, she said, I cook, I clean, I manage the household, and I'm doing the work that was asked of me and doing it well. If people in Dry Hollow have the leisure to invent narratives about that, they're welcome to. I'm not sure what any of it has to do with you. Elias is a friend, he said. I have his interests at heart. Then I'm sure he knows how to reach you if he needs your counsel. She picked up the last package. I have to get back, the dinner won't make itself. She turned away from him and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and she drove back toward Iron Creek Road with the particular kind of controlled, focused stillness she'd been using since the age of 14 to manage the specific emotion she was feeling, which was not fear and was not quite anger, but was something between them that had no useful name. She'd been in Dry Hollow 8 weeks. She'd bought supplies, kept to herself, done her work, and managed to mostly avoid contact with the social machinery of the community. She'd understood from the beginning that the machinery existed and that she was, by nature of who she was and where she'd come from and what she looked like, the kind of person the machinery could damage. What she hadn't fully accounted for was Victor Langford, why he cared, what he wanted, what the interest in Elias Hawthorne's household might actually be about. She thought about it on the drive back. She turned it over the way she turned over a problem in a recipe, looking for the part that didn't fit, the ingredient that explained the result you were getting. A man of Langford's position didn't waste time on idle social concern for a neighboring rancher's kitchen staff. If he'd come to say what he'd said, it was because he had a reason. The most likely reasons were the ones that followed from self-interest, and the self-interest of a man who ran a large cattle operation adjacent to a struggling ranch was not difficult to imagine. She thought about the way he'd said circumstances, that brief, deliberate pause before the word, letting its weight do his work for him. She thought about what he'd said about Elias. I'm thinking of your reputation, not Elias's, hers. He wasn't worried about Mabel Rowan's reputation. He was using it. As a lever on what? She wasn't sure yet, but she understood now that she'd walked into something larger than a kitchen posting and that the walk had been noticed. She didn't tell Elias about the conversation immediately. She was still sorting out what she knew and what she suspected, and she'd learned that bringing half-formed concerns to people who were already managing difficulty usually made things worse rather than better. She kept working, kept the household running, and she listened more carefully to the information that moved through the territory in the way information always moved through frontier communities. Through the ranch hands at the dinner table, through the delivery man who brought the mail twice weekly, through June, who had her mother's network of observation and was often smarter about what she heard than people realized. What she learned over the next 2 weeks was this. Elias Hawthorne owed money on Iron Creek Ranch, not a catastrophic amount, but enough to matter, borrowed against a hard year when the herd losses had been severe. The note was held by the Territorial Lending Bank in Millhaven, 40 miles east. The bank had connections, but the kind of connections that meant it was not entirely independent of other large interests in the region. The kind of connections that, if you followed them far enough, ended at the double bar L. She also learned that Victor Langford had a daughter named Vivian, who was 24 and unmarried, and whom he had apparently been maneuvering toward an alliance with Elias for at least a year, not romantically, or not primarily romantically, but as the kind of arrangement that made sense to men who thought of land and resources the way chess players thought of board positions. Vivian Langford, married to Elias Hawthorne, meant the Double Bar L had effective influence over Iron Creek's water access. Iron Creek's creek was the only year-round water source for the southern section of Langford's range, and he'd been paying access fees on it for 2 decades. The marriage would make those fees irrelevant. The merger would be, for Victor Langford, a significant consolidation. This explained the conversation in the grain exchange yard. It explained it completely and without mystery. Mabel was not an obstacle to Victor Langford's plans because she posed any romantic competition for Vivian. She was an obstacle because a functional household with a competent cook and a stable routine made Elias Hawthorne less desperate, and desperation was what the plan required. A man whose daughters were fed and whose house was running and who was starting to engage with the world again was a man who could afford to think clearly, to look at the terms of what was being proposed and decide they didn't suit him. A desperate man was a different calculation. She told Elias on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen while she was checking the preserves. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things. The facts first, the interpretation second, no dramatics. She told him about the conversation with Langford. She told him what she'd pieced together about the banknote and the water access. She told him she might be wrong about some of the connections. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. When something was serious, he went quiet. Not absent, just still. "You figured all this out from a conversation at the grain exchange," he said when she finished. "I figured it out because I paid attention. I've been paying attention for 2 months. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the kitchen table, not at her. "Langford approached me in July," he said, "before you came. He said Vivian was interested in the ranch. He made it sound like it was her idea." "Was it?" A pause. "No, it didn't sound like it was." He rubbed his face, the exhausted gesture she'd seen him make when something was more complicated than he wanted to deal with. "I told him I wasn't looking for that kind of arrangement. I thought that was the end of it." "It wasn't?" "No." He looked up. "How bad is the note at the bank?" "I don't know the exact number, but based on what Cole mentioned about the last payment," Cole was the senior ranch hand, and he'd been at Iron Creek for 12 years and occasionally said more than he meant to when the topic was money and the concern was real. "I think you have maybe 1 bad season before it becomes a serious problem." Elias looked at the window. It was dark outside. Early October now, the nights coming cold and fast, and the kitchen was warm behind them. He was quiet for a long time. "What would you do?" he asked. Not in the way of a man who needed someone else to decide for him, but in the way of a man who wanted a different angle on the same problem. Mabel set down the jar she was holding. "I'd stop letting Langford be the only person who controls how this story gets told," she said. "In Dry Hollow, everyone knows your business, but they're getting the version Langford gives them. Your house has been closed for 3 years. You haven't been visible. People fill in what they don't see with what they're given." She paused. "The gathering last month. People saw you there. That mattered. But you need more of that, not less. I don't want to manage impressions," he said, and his voice had a slight edge in it, the edge of someone who found that kind of thing distasteful, which she respected even though it was working against him. "You don't have to manage them. You just have to show up enough that people have actual information to work with instead of whatever Langford is handing them." She picked up the jar again. "And you should talk to someone who knows water rights law before Langford decides to make the banknote a more urgent problem." He looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this more than I have." "I had more time to think about it. You were checking fences." He was quiet again. Then, unexpectedly, a small and somewhat rueful sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that Mabel counted it. "All right," he said. "I'll look into the lawyer." "Good." He stood up. He was almost to the kitchen door when he stopped and half-turned. "Mabel." "Yes." He seemed to be working towards something. The tiredness in his face was still there. It was always there. But there was something else in it now, something that was looking for the right words and not quite finding them. "The things Langford is saying, about you, about why you're here. I know what he's saying. It's not—" He stopped. "It isn't fair, what he's doing. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hawthorne, people have been saying things about me that aren't fair since I was old enough to notice people saying things. I haven't changed their minds by arguing with them, and I'm not going to start now. What I can do is keep doing my work well and let that speak." She paused. "What Langford is saying about me is a distraction from what he's actually doing, which is trying to take something from you. I'd focus there." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded just once and went back to his office. The kitchen was quiet. Mabel finished the preserves, banked the fire, and stood at the window for a while looking at the dark yard, where the kitchen garden was sleeping under the first hard frost. October turned mean in the way of Montana Octobers, which was not gradual but sudden, an overnight decision by the weather to stop pretending and commit to what it actually intended. The ranch hands pulled their winter gear from storage. The herd was moved to the southern pasture. The root cellar was stocked, which Mabel supervised with the methodical focus she brought to anything she was doing for the first time in an unfamiliar environment and could not afford to do wrong. The gossip in Dry Hollow, meanwhile, had decided to stop pretending too. It reached Iron Creek through multiple channels. Through Cole, who heard it from the farrier. Through the mail delivery man, who seemed uncomfortable being the carrier of it, but was going to tell them anyway. Through June, who had gone into town with Elias for supplies and come back with a set expression on her 12-year-old face that meant she'd heard something she wasn't entirely sure how to process. She came to Mabel in the kitchen after supper while Elsie was already in bed. "People are saying you're manipulating my father," she said. Straight out, the way June always led with difficult things, like ripping a plaster. "For money, or for, I don't know, some other reason, to take over the ranch." Mabel kept kneading the bread. "Who's saying it? Mrs. Pierce? And the women she talks to?" A pause. "There were men, too. Mr. Aldridge from the feed store. He told Cole that it wasn't decent, you being here." "What did Cole say?" "He told Aldridge to mind his own business." "That sounds like Cole." June was quiet for a moment. "Is it true?" Mabel looked at her. "What do you think?" June's expression did the complicated thing it did when she was being honest about something she didn't want to be honest about. "I think you make the house work," she said slowly. "I think my father eats supper at the table now instead of in his office, and he sleeps actual hours instead of working all night, and Elsie stopped waking up with bad dreams as often." She paused. "I think those things wouldn't happen if you were manipulating someone. I think when someone is manipulating you, it feels different. How does it feel?" "Like you're always a little confused," June said. "Like things shift when you're not looking." Mabel nodded. "That's right." "This doesn't feel like that." "No," Mabel agreed. "It doesn't." She paused. "I'm not going to be able to stop people saying what they're saying, June. I can't go into Dry Hollow and argue with Mrs. Pierce. I wouldn't do it even if I thought it would work, which it wouldn't." "I know." June looked at the work table. "It makes me angry," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, just slightly, the fracture in the controlled surface that showed how much effort the control was costing her. "You haven't done anything wrong. You've made everything better, and they're just—" "I know," Mabel said. "It's not fair." "No, it's not." June pressed her mouth together in the particular way she had when she was managing an emotion that was threatening to become visible. "What do we do?" Mabel pushed the dough aside and looked at June, really looked at her, this 12-year-old who had been carrying too much for too long and who was now being asked to carry the additional weight of injustice without a good outlet for the anger it generated. "We keep working," she said. "We make this place so clearly, obviously good, that the story eventually corrects itself. It takes longer than it should. It's not satisfying in the way that arguing would be satisfying. But it works." June was quiet. Then, "What if it doesn't work in time?" Mabel thought about the banknote, about Langford's pale, watchful eyes in the grain exchange yard, about the water rights and the slow, quiet campaign being run against Iron Creek from the outside. "Then we handle that when it comes," she said. It wasn't a reassuring answer, but it was an honest one, and June had made it clear from the first week that she could tell the difference. The bread went in the oven. The kitchen stayed warm. Outside, the October wind picked up against the house, feeling along the eaves for the places that weren't tight, the way everything eventually looked for what wasn't quite solid, what could be worked at, what might eventually give. Mabel added wood to the fire and let it burn. The lawyer Elias found was named Garrett Poole, and he worked out of Mill Haven in an office above a dry goods warehouse that smelled permanently of cedar and old paper. He was 63 years old, originally from Ohio, and he had the particular quality of a man who had spent 4 decades in territorial law and arrived at a place beyond surprise. Not cynical exactly, but no longer capable of being shocked by what people did to each other over land and water. Elias came back from Millhaven on a Thursday in late October with the look of a man who had received complicated news delivered in uncomplicated terms, which was, Mabel had learned, worse than complicated news delivered badly. It meant you understood exactly what you were dealing with and couldn't comfort yourself with confusion. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking his coat off. Mabel poured coffee and set it in front of him and didn't ask. He'd tell her when he was ready, or he wouldn't. And either way, she'd have the same information she had now, which was that whatever Poole had said had landed hard. The water rights are older than the ranch, he said finally. Clara's father filed the original claim in 1861. It's Iron Creek water, always has been. The documentation is sound. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Poole says the documentation is sound. He also says Langford's lawyers have found an argument about a survey discrepancy in the 1874 county refiling that they're planning to use as the basis for a challenge. A challenge to the water rights, to the original boundary of the claim. If they can establish the survey was inaccurate, they can argue the water access was never legally Iron Creek's in the way the deed implies. He paused. Poole says it's weak. He also says weak arguments win in territorial courts when the other side has the money to keep filing motions, and the side being challenged doesn't. Mabel sat down across from him. What does it cost to defend it? More than I have, if it goes to a full hearing. He looked at the table. Poole thinks they're not planning to take it to court right away. He thinks the legal threat is meant to make me sell or agree to Langford's terms before it gets there. Because once it gets there, the costs alone— He stopped. Would break the ranch. Yes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up. It had been building all day, the particular restless gusting that preceded weather in this part of Montana, and the bare branches of the cottonwood near the fence were moving in a way that had Mabel's attention even as she was focused on Elias. Poole also said something else, Elias said. His voice had shifted slightly, taken on the careful flatness of a man relaying information he'd been turning over for hours. He said Langford has done this before. Not here, in the Clearwater Valley, 10 years ago. A family called Morrow. Small operation, good water claim, survey discrepancy that turned out to be manufactured. They held out for 2 years, then they didn't. What happened to them? Sold at a third of value. Langford's people bought the note from the bank when it came due and foreclosed inside a week. He paused. Poole knew the Morrow lawyer. He said by the end the family had nothing left to fight with. Not just money, just nothing. Mabel looked at him. He was staring at the coffee he hadn't touched, and she could see the weight of it on him. Not panic. Elias didn't panic, but the grinding recognition of a man who had finally understood the dimensions of what he was up against. 3 years of grief, a struggling operation, 2 daughters, a banknote, and now a legal strategy specifically designed to exhaust him into surrender. Elias, she said. He looked up. Who else has Langford done this to? In this county, not Clearwater, here. He thought about it. There was talk, a few years back, about the Delaney place north of Ridgeline. Tom Delaney ended up selling and moving to Helena. I never knew the full story. Did Delaney have a water claim? A pause. I don't know, probably. His eyes sharpened slightly. You think there's a pattern? I think a man who did it in Clearwater and possibly to Delaney and is now doing it to you didn't build that approach once. He built it because it works and he kept using it. She paused. Which means the people it worked on are still out there, and they might be willing to say so. Elias was quiet for a moment and she could see him working through it, pulling the threads. Poole mentioned another ranch, he said slowly. In the current county, the Aldermore operation, west side of the valley. He said they'd had dealings with Langford's lawyers over a grazing rights dispute last year. It didn't go to court. They settled. But Poole said the settlement terms were unusual. Does he know the Aldermore owner? Fletcher Aldermore. I've met him twice. We're not friends, but I know who he is. Can you reach him? Elias looked at her steadily. You want me to approach Fletcher Aldermore, who I barely know, and ask him to join a legal fight against the most powerful cattle operator in the county. I want you to find out if he's already in the fight and doesn't know it yet, Mabel said. There's a difference. Something moved in his face. That same brief shift she'd seen before. The involuntary thing. The person underneath the weathered-down exterior responding to something before the careful exterior had time to weigh it. He picked up his coffee and finally drank it. I'll write to him, he said. November arrived and the winter settled into the valley the way it settled into every Montana valley. Completely, without apology, making all summer concerns feel distant and slightly theoretical. The ranch work shifted to its winter rhythms. The herd close managed, the buildings checked against the cold, the days shorter, and the work more internal. The ranch hands were down to 3 through the winter. Cole, a quiet young man named Davis, and an older Crow man named Wakely, who had worked Iron Creek's fence lines for 11 years and spoke in the careful economy of someone choosing every word. The household had found its own winter rhythm, too. Supper was reliably the warmest part of the day in every sense. The kitchen running full heat from the stove, Elsie talking enough for 3 people, June occasionally contributing observations that made Elias look at his older daughter with the specific expression of a parent discovering that a child has become, without announcement, someone with a genuine point of view. He was in the kitchen most evenings now, not always talking, but present. The contraction she'd observed in him in those first weeks, the way he'd made himself smaller and smaller inside the grief, had not reversed exactly, but it had stopped progressing, the way a wound that's been properly tended stops worsening even before it starts healing. She didn't know what to call what was happening in the house. She didn't try to name it. She just kept making it possible. Her mother's recipe book had become something else during these months. She'd started annotating it, not just using the recipes, but adjusting them for what was available on the frontier, substituting, improvising, noting what worked and what didn't. She'd begun supplying 2 pies a week to a hotel in Millhaven whose cook had tasted one at the October gathering and tracked her down 3 days later with a straightforward business proposition. He'd pay per pie, pick them up with the weekly supply delivery, and he'd double the order if the quality stayed consistent. She told him she'd think about it. She'd thought about it for 2 days. Then she said yes. It was a small thing. 4 pies a week, eventually 6. The income was modest, but it was hers, separate from her wages, money she'd made from something she knew how to do well, and it went into a tin box under the floor of her room with the steady patience of someone who understood that small amounts, accumulated carefully over time, eventually became something substantial. She hadn't told Elias. It wasn't his business, and she wasn't doing anything that interfered with her work at the ranch. But she thought about it sometimes in the mornings, when the house was still dark and the stove was just coming up to heat, and the day was all potential and no complication yet. She thought about what it would look like eventually. A bakery. A real one. Not the borrowed kitchen of someone else's ranch, but her own. She wasn't there yet. But the direction existed, and that was enough. The letter from Fletcher Aldermore came in the 3rd week of November. Elias read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with June and Elsie finishing breakfast on either side of him, and Mabel saw his expression change while he read it, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has been holding a position against uncertainty and has just received confirmation that the ground they were standing on was real. He wants to meet, Elias said when he'd finished. What does he say about Langford? Elias handed her the letter without comment. Fletcher Aldermore's handwriting was the handwriting of a man who'd learned to write as a practical skill rather than an art. Blocky, functional, almost no punctuation. But what it said was clear enough. The settlement he'd reached with Langford's lawyers the previous year had included a clause that prevented him from filing further challenges to certain boundary questions in the Western Valley. It was a clause that had seemed reasonable at the time, under the pressure of the moment, but that he had come to understand over the following months had effectively signed away his right to contest the same survey discrepancy that was apparently now being used against Iron Creek. He had not understood when he signed that the discrepancy was manufactured. He understood it now. He was, his letter said, in the particular compressed language of a man choosing his words carefully, willing to discuss what options remain available. Mabel set the letter down. He knows. He knows. Elias agreed. Elsie, who had been eating her porridge with focused efficiency and monitoring the adult conversation with 8-year-old peripheral awareness, said, "Who's Fletcher Aldermore?" "A man who might help us with something," Elias said. "Is he nice?" "I don't know yet." "Cole says the only way to know if a person's nice is to watch how they treat their horses," Elsie said. "That's not bad advice," Mabel said. That's. The fire started on a Tuesday in early December, which was the kind of detail that lodged in Mabel's memory afterward. Not the date exactly, but the day of the week, the particular quality of a Tuesday, its ordinariness, the way nothing about it had announced itself as the kind of day when everything changed. The morning had been cold and clear, the sky the flat blue of deep winter. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, and the ground was frozen solid enough that the horses' hooves rang against it. Mabel had been up since before 5, baking, the hotel order plus a batch of rolls for the ranch hands, and the kitchen had been warm and flower-scented and entirely normal in every way. She was in the kitchen garden, mid-morning, checking the straw she'd laid over the herb beds against the cold, when she smelled it. Smoke. But not the clean wood smoke smell of the stoves. Something rougher, heavier, with the particular edge of burning grass in it that was different from burning wood. She stood up and looked south. The smoke column was maybe 4 miles off, but it was not a column. It was a wall. Even at this distance, she could see the base of it was wide, ragged, orange-lit from below in the way that meant the fire was already large and moving fast, pushed by the wind that had been building since the previous afternoon. The grass between here and there was dry as paper. It had been a dry November. She was already moving toward the barn before she'd consciously decided to. Cole was inside, and he saw her face and was out the door before she said a word, and they both stood in the yard for a moment looking south at the smoke that was already, in the 2 minutes since she'd first seen it, visibly closer. "Wind's pushing it north," Cole said. He said it flatly, the way experienced people stated facts about disasters. Not to frighten, just to establish what was real. "How fast?" "Fast enough." He turned. "I need to get to Elias. He's checking the north fence." Davis went with him. She was already thinking through it, not the fire itself, but everything around it, the herd, the buildings, the water, the people. "Wakely's in the equipment shed. Get him. I'll get the girls." Cole didn't argue or ask if she was sure. He went. What happened in the next 6 hours was not the kind of thing that could be described cleanly in sequence, because it didn't happen in sequence. It happened in the overlapping, simultaneous way of real emergencies, where 10 things needed doing at once, and the only question was what order to fail in if you couldn't do all of them. Mabel organized what she could organize. She got June and Elsie out of the house and into the yard. She sent June, who was 12 and competent and didn't panic, to the ridgeline road with one of the horses. The message was simple. Fire coming from the south, Iron Creek Ranch. They needed anyone who could come. June looked at her for 1 second, asking with her eyes if this was as serious as it appeared, and Mabel looked back with the same steadiness she used for everything, and June turned the horse and rode. Wakely, who had seen range fires before and whose particular quality of calm in emergencies was the most valuable thing on the ranch at that moment, took charge of the herd with Davis. The horses were moved first, fire-panicked horses in ways that made them dangerous, and then the cattle, pushed north toward the creek where the ground was wet and the grass less dry. Mabel opened the house. She cleared the main room of anything flammable that could be moved, curtains, cushions, the paper and dry goods from the kitchen, and she ran a line of buckets from the yard pump to the edge of the porch, and she organized Elsie, who was frightened but functional in the way of children given specific tasks, into a relay position. She wasn't going to let the house burn if she could stop it. Other ranchers began arriving by mid-afternoon, 3 men from the Ridgeline Road who'd seen the smoke before June even reached them. A family from the Morrison spread who came with 2 wagons and 4 extra hands. A woman named Harriet Bowl, whose husband was in the fire line, and who arrived alone with a wagon full of supplies and asked, with the directness of someone who'd dealt with range fires before, what needed doing and where. Mabel put Harriet in charge of the supply distribution. Food, water, bandages, the coffee that needed to keep coming as long as there were people working, and turned the ranch yard into something that functioned. It was not orderly. Nothing about it was orderly. There were moments when the smoke was thick enough that Mabel couldn't see the barn from the house, and moments when the wind shifted and the fire's sound, that particular roar, low and huge and implacable, seemed to be coming from the wrong direction, and moments when she was doing three things at once and failing at all three with just enough success to prevent any of the failures from being catastrophic. Elias arrived at a run from the north fence line in the early afternoon, having seen the smoke and come back at speed, and he arrived into a yard that was already in motion, the firefighting crews coming through for water and food, the injured being treated on the porch by Harriet, the stock secured, the system Mabel had set up running with the imperfect, urgent functionality of something built for emergency rather than design. He stood at the edge of the yard for a moment and looked at all of it. Then he found Mabel at the supply table and said, "What do you need from me?" She handed him a water bucket. "West Fire Line. They're running short." He took it and went. Man. The fire stopped 2 miles south of the main buildings. It stopped partly because the wind shifted again in the late afternoon, turning east, and partly because the fire line that the ranchers had managed to cut along the old creek tributary held, and partly because of something as unglamorous as a stretch of rocky ground that gave the fire less to eat. It did not stop because of any single heroic act or decisive moment. It stopped the way fires stopped, because the conditions finally worked against it, and because enough people had been in the right places to make use of those conditions when they changed. The ranch was intact. The herd was intact. 3 men had burns. 2 minor, 1 more serious, a ranch hand from the Morrison spread named Pete Calloway, who'd gotten his left forearm badly enough to need real medical attention. Mabel had done what she could with the supplies available, and Harriet had sent her husband back to Millhaven for the doctor, and Pete was conscious and in reasonable spirits by evening, considering. The neighboring ranchers stayed through the night, some of them. The women organized food for everyone still on the property, and they sat in the yard and in the kitchen and on the porch with the particular exhaustion of people who had spent themselves completely and were now existing on the other side of the thing they'd been fighting. There was talking and there was silence in equal measure, and someone produced a bottle of rye that moved around the yard without comment. Mabel didn't drink. She sat on the porch step with a cup of coffee and watched the south horizon, where the smoke had thinned to something pale and dispersing in the cold night air, and she let her hands rest in her lap and did not move for about 15 minutes, which was the longest she'd been still all day. Harriet Bowl sat down beside her. Harriet was maybe 55, broad through the shoulders, with work-calloused hands and the face of someone who had spent decades in weather without apologizing for it. She'd been formidably useful today, and Mabel had liked her without having time to think about it. "You organized this," Harriet said. Not a question. "Everyone organized themselves," Mabel said. "I just pointed people. That's what organizing is." Harriet drank her coffee. "I heard things about you. In town." Mabel looked at the horizon. "I imagine you did." "I didn't know what to think when I arrived. I'll tell you that plainly." "I appreciate the plain telling. Now I know what to think." Harriet paused. "Langford's been making things difficult for you." "For the ranch. For you specifically. I know how he operates." She set her cup down on the step. "My husband and Victor Langford do not get along. There's a history. I won't bore you with it, but I'll tell you this. The man uses information the way other people use fences. He keeps track of what everyone owes and what everyone fears, and he applies it at the time of maximum inconvenience." She paused. "He's been waiting for Elias to have a bad enough season that the banknote becomes a weapon. I don't know if this fire was his doing." "It wasn't," Mabel said. "It started on the Ridgeline dry flats. You can't control where lightning strikes." "No, but he'll use it if he can." Harriet looked at her. "You should know that people in Dry Hollow saw what happened here today. Not just my husband. There were people from town in that fire line. They came out, some of them, because of you." Mabel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "June Hawthorne rode into Ridgeline and asked for help," Harriet said, "and people came. And when they got here, they saw what you'd set up. The supply system, the injured men being looked after, the stock already secured. They saw you running it." She paused. "Mrs. Pierce was not in that fire line, but the people who were will talk to the people who weren't. That's how it works." Mabel didn't say anything for a moment. She was tired. the bone-level tired that came from a day of sustained emergency. And she was having difficulty processing the idea of Dry Hollow's opinion as something that could shift, that wasn't simply a fixed condition she moved around. "It shouldn't take a fire," she said finally, "for people to look at what's actually there." "No," Harriet agreed. "It shouldn't, but it's what we've got." Assad. 3 days after the fire, a writer came from Langford's lawyer. The letter was addressed to Elias and delivered to the house, and Elias read it standing in the kitchen in the early afternoon with Cole and Mabel both present, which was the kind of thing that wouldn't have happened 2 months ago. Cole being in the kitchen in the middle of the day, Elias reading business correspondence there rather than in his office. But the house had become gradually the kind of place where the serious things happened, where the warmth was. The letter was 3 pages of legal language that reduced, when Elias read it aloud, and they all worked through it, to a clear and ugly proposition. In light of the fire and the financial strain it represented, the bank's note on Iron Creek Ranch would be called for full payment within 60 days. If payment could not be made, and Langford's lawyers clearly believed it couldn't, the bank would accept a transfer of the water rights claim as settlement in lieu of cash. 60 days. Just past the new year. Cole read it again over Elias's shoulder. "You move fast," he said, and his voice was flat with a specific quality of anger that was all the more effective for being quiet. "He had this ready," Mabel said, "before the fire. He was waiting for something to use, and the fire gave him the timing." Elias set the letter on the table. His face was controlled in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of very serious. No expression at all, just the stillness, the looking at nothing that meant everything. 60 days, he said. "Can you pay the note?" Mabel asked. A pause. "Not in full, not even close." "Then we need Aldermore. You need to meet with him before the end of the week." "I know. And you need Poole. Tell him about the timing, that the call came 3 days after the fire. That matters legally, I think. The appearance of using a natural disaster as financial leverage." "I'll go to Millhaven tomorrow." Cole folded his arms. He was looking at the letter on the table. "There's something else, Tristan," he said. "The Morrison Ranch, Pete Calloway's people. Morrison's been having his own trouble with Langford's people over the eastern grazing boundary. I know because Pete told me about it last spring." He paused. "Morrison came out in the fire line. He brought 4 men. That means something about where he stands." Mabel looked at Cole. "Would Morrison talk to Aldermore if Elias asked him to meet?" Cole looked at Elias. "The 3 of you together is different than any one of you alone. Langford's strategy depends on isolating people, keeps them thinking they're the only one with the problem." Elias was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the letter. Then he looked at Mabel, and there was something in the look. Not asking permission, not that, but the look of a man acknowledging that he was in a conversation he couldn't have had 3 months ago with a person he wouldn't have trusted 3 months ago, and that both of those things had changed. "I'll write to Morrison tonight," he said, "and Aldermore, and Poole." Mabel picked up the letter and folded it. "I'll make supper," she said. It was not an adequate response to the situation, but supper still needed to happen, and the kitchen was warm, and the work in front of them was real even if its shape was not yet clear, and she had long ago learned that the best thing you could do with a problem you couldn't solve tonight was to do the things that kept you solid enough to face it in the morning. She put the letter in the kitchen drawer, where the household accounts were kept, and she started on the stove. Fletcher Aldermore was a lean, sun-damaged man in his late 50s who chewed the end of a pencil when he was thinking, and who had Mabel observed within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. The particular quality of someone who had been badly wrong about something important and was still living in the middle of that wrongness and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. He arrived at Iron Creek on a Thursday in the second week of December, 3 days after Elias's letter, which meant he'd been considering the meeting before the letter arrived, had been sitting with the question of what to do next, and needed only the nudge of someone else reaching out first. He came alone, which told Mabel something. A man who brought people to a meeting like this was establishing position. A man who came alone was genuinely trying to figure something out. Elias met him in the yard. Mabel had coffee and food ready in the kitchen, which was where the meeting ended up happening. Not by design, but because the kitchen was warm and the office was cold, and December in Montana had a way of overriding formality. Morrison had sent word that he would come, but was delayed by a lame horse. He'd arrive by afternoon or the next morning. Aldermore sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter from Langford's lawyers that Elias put in front of him, and he read it with the careful attention of a man who had read a similar letter before and understood what he was looking at now with the particular clarity that came from hindsight. He moved the timeline up, Aldermore said. When I dealt with him, he gave 90 days. The fire, Elias said. He was waiting for something to use. Aldermore set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, Mabel could see him deciding something. The specific expression of a person working through whether to say the thing they'd been not saying. I signed a settlement last March, he said. I thought I was getting a favorable outcome. My lawyer, not Poole, a younger man from Clearwater, I didn't know any better, told me the water boundary clause was standard language. He paused. It wasn't standard. It waived my right to contest the same survey discrepancy that Langford is now using against you, which means I can't file in support of your claim without potentially reopening my own settlement in a way that Poole will tell you what that means legally. What it means practically is that I'm in a difficult position. Elias was looking at the table. You came anyway. I came because I can tell you things that are harder to prove than to say. Aldermore looked at Mabel briefly, then back to Elias. The survey discrepancy isn't a discovery. Langford's people manufactured it. I know this because the same surveyor who filed the amended report on my eastern boundary, a man named Rhett Collier, out of Butte, filed a similar amended report on 3 other properties in the last 8 years. All of them properties Langford subsequently acquired or obtained rights over. Mabel set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. The same surveyor, she said. The same man. 3 separate counties, different years, but the same signature on each amended filing. Aldermore looked at her. He'd been assessing her since he arrived. She'd noticed that, the way he kept returning his attention to her in the pauses, calibrating something. Your name was mentioned to me, Miss Rowan, before I came, by Harriet Bowl. Harriet and I met during the fire. She told me what you did during the fire. He said it without inflection. Not a compliment, just a fact, which was its own kind of compliment from a man like Aldermore. She said you were someone worth talking to. The surveyor, Mabel said, bringing it back. If the same man filed false reports on multiple properties, is that something Poole can use? Poole would need the original filed copies to compare them, Aldermore said. The county records in Butte would have them. The records here in Millhaven would have the local ones. He paused. The challenge is that pulling those records takes time, and someone has to do it, and Langford's 60-day timeline is designed to make that impossible. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind was mild for December. Whatever violence the season had planned for later, it was holding back today. Not impossible, Mabel said. Difficult. There's a difference. Aldermore looked at her again. This time there was something more direct in it. The records in Butte, someone would need to go there and spend time in the county clerk's office pulling the surveyor's filed reports. That's not a half-day job. How long? 3-4 days minimum. If you know what you're looking for, and the clerk is cooperative, he paused. If you can get copies of the relevant filings back to Poole within 3 weeks, I believe he can file a preemptive challenge that would freeze Langford's legal action pending investigation. The 60-day note call would be temporarily unenforceable while the survey fraud is being examined. Elias was looking at the table. I can't leave the ranch for 3 or 4 days right now. Not with the herd in winter and the situation with... I know, Aldermore said. I'm not suggesting you go. The silence that followed that was the particular silence of a room in which several people were thinking the same thing and waiting to see who said it first. I'll go, Mabel said. Elias looked at her. I can read legal documents, she said before he could object. I've been reading the ones on this kitchen table for 2 months. I know what the survey discrepancy claim says, and I know what we're looking for. I can get to Butte by rail from Millhaven, spend 3 days in the county records office, and come back with copies. She paused. Unless there's someone else. There wasn't someone else, and everyone in the room knew it. Cole couldn't leave the ranch either. Davis was 22 and capable, but not someone you sent to a county clerk's office to pull legal filings in a fraud investigation. Aldermore was legally constrained by his settlement. Morrison, when he arrived, would have his own ranch to manage. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Something was working through his face. Not reluctance exactly, but the adjustment of a man who had been, without realizing it, unconsciously relying on a person, and who was now confronting that reliance directly for the first time. "The rail fare," he said, "and the hotel." "I have money," she said, which was true. The pie tin box under her floor had been accumulating for 4 months. "No," he said, "Iron Creek pays for it." "All right. And you take the good horse to Millhaven Station, not the roan." He paused. "The roan has been off her front left since Tuesday." "I noticed," she said. He nodded once. The conversation was over in the way that conversations between practical people were sometimes over, not with any ceremony, just with the clear sense that the decision had been made and the next thing was to act on it. She left on a Saturday before first light, with Poole's letter of instruction in her coat pocket and a list of the specific filing dates and county records to look for in her own handwriting in the recipe book, which she brought because it was the most organized document she owned, and the surveyor file list looked, to her eye, not unlike a complex recipe requiring precision. June was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, just sitting there, in the dark, with the lamp turned low. "You don't have to see me off," Mabel said. "I know." June watched her check her bag. "How long?" 5 days, probably, maybe 6. "Who's going to make bread?" "You are." "I wrote out the instructions. They're on the work table." June looked at the work table. The instructions were there in Mabel's precise handwriting, full of the practical specificity that June appreciated and that most adults forgot to include when they explained things to children. "I've made bread before," June said. "I know. These are just reminders." June was quiet for a moment. Outside, the horse was tied at the gate, breathing visible in the cold air, patient. The sky was still fully dark. "Mabel?" She looked at her. "Be careful." June said it in the flat, controlled way she said important things, the way she'd learned to say them to prevent the weight of them from showing. "The roads in winter, I'll be fine." "I know you'll probably be fine. I'm saying it anyway." Mabel picked up her bag. On an impulse she didn't analyze, she put her hand briefly on June's shoulder. Not a hug. June wasn't a hugger, and Mabel respected that about her. Just a hand on the shoulder for a moment, solid and present. June didn't pull away. "Keep the fire going in the kitchen," Mabel said, "and make sure Elsie eats breakfast before she goes outside in the morning. She's been skipping it." "I know, she does that." "It's cold enough now that it matters more. I'll handle it." Mabel went out to the horse. The county clerk in Butte was a small, methodical man named Henders, who wore the same green wool vest every day she was there, and who had the territorial bureaucrats' carefully cultivated indifference to the reasons people wanted records, caring only that they filled out the correct request forms in the correct order and didn't disrupt the filing system. She spent 3 days in a narrow back room of the county offices with stacks of bound survey filings going back 15 years, working through them with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. Methodical, unhurried, not assuming she'd found the right thing until she'd checked it against 3 other things. She found Rhett Collier's signature on 4 separate amended survey reports in Butte County alone. 2 of them were for properties that had subsequently been acquired by entities connected to the double bar L, which she confirmed by cross-referencing the land transfer records that Henders, after she explained what she was looking for without explaining why, in a way that would create complications, located for her with the particular cooperative efficiency of a man who liked an organized mind. She had the copies made. The clerk's office had a copying service for an additional fee, and she organized them into 2 sets, one to send directly to Poole and one to keep herself. She sent the first set by wire courier from the Butte post office on the 3rd day, with a summary letter she'd written the night before in her hotel room. The hotel was modest. She hadn't spent more than she needed to, and she'd eaten most of her meals from a bakery 2 blocks from the county offices that produced a reasonable sourdough and a very good bean soup. She'd noted professionally what they were doing with their crust, which involved a technique she hadn't tried and was interested in. She was, to her own slight surprise, all right. Not lonely exactly. Not happy either. This was not a pleasant trip, the work was tedious and the stakes made it harder, and she'd woken twice in the night with the anxious knowledge of everything that depended on what she found and what Poole could do with it. But she was functioning well, doing work she was capable of, making decisions about what was important and what wasn't, and there was something solid in that. The way there was always something solid in competence when you could feel it working. She thought about Iron Creek while she worked, not with sentimentality. She wasn't built for sentimentality, but with the specific awareness of a person who understands that what they're doing in one place is connected to what matters in another. The house with its kitchen and its kitchen garden, the stove that was running well now, the lavender that had made it through November, Elsie's running commentary on everything, June's careful, controlled, formidable intelligence, Elias at the table in the evenings, not talking, just present in the way that had gradually become something she relied on without meaning to. She'd been at Iron Creek 5 months. She would not have predicted on the morning she walked the Bitterroot Road in July with 43 cents in a battered pan, that 5 months later she would be sitting in a county records office in Butte, pulling legal documents to prevent a corrupt cattle baron from stripping the place of its water rights. She would not have predicted any of it, including the particular weight of the things she'd come to understand about herself over those 5 months. That she didn't just want the ranch to survive. She wanted it. Not in a possessive sense. It wasn't hers, and she knew that. But she had put herself into it, and the things you put yourself into fully became, in some sense that was real, without being simple, yours. She took the train back on the 5th day with both sets of documents in her bag. Morrison had arrived at Iron Creek by the time she returned. Dan Morrison, who turned out to be a stocky, direct-spoken man in his mid-40s with a red beard and the handshake of someone who'd spent 30 years deciding in the first 10 seconds of meeting people whether they were worth his time. He'd apparently decided about Mabel within the first 30 seconds of her return, because he shook her hand like she was an equal and said, "Aldermore told me what you went to Butte for. Good thinking," in the tone of someone who meant it without embellishment. Poole had already received the courier copies. His wire response had arrived the previous day. He believed the Collier filings constituted sufficient evidence of systematic fraud to file an emergency petition with the territorial court challenging the legitimacy of the survey amendments on which Langford's entire legal strategy depended. If the court accepted the petition, and Poole believed they would, on the strength of the evidence, the banknote call would be frozen pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. Elias read the wire aloud in the kitchen, Morrison and Aldermore and Cole all present, and the room was quiet for a moment after he finished. "It's not over," Aldermore said, because it needed saying. "The investigation could take months. Langford will fight it. He has the resources to drag this out." "But the 60-day deadline is gone," Morrison said. "For now." "For now is enough," Elias said. He looked around the table. "I want to be clear about something. Both of you came to this at personal risk. Aldermore, your settlement, Poole said reopening it is a real possibility." Aldermore picked up his coffee. "It's possible. My lawyer, the new one, not the idiot from Clearwater, thinks the fraud finding would actually void the settlement entirely, since it was based on the fraudulent filing. But that's not certain." He paused. "I signed a bad deal under pressure, and I've been living with it for 9 months. If this breaks open and I get my boundary rights back, that's worth the risk." He paused again. "And I don't like what he did to the Morrows in Clearwater. I didn't know about them until Poole told me. That bothers me." Morrison nodded. "Same principle with me. The eastern boundary dispute he's been running on my grazing rights. If the fraud finding applies there too, it changes things considerably." He set down his cup. "I'm not doing this out of charity. I want that on the record." "It's on the record," Elias said. Mabel had been listening from her position near the stove. She wasn't part of this conversation in the formal sense. She wasn't a property owner. She wasn't a party to any of the legal action. But she was in the room because the room was the kitchen, and the kitchen was her space, and because no one had suggested she shouldn't be. She thought about what Harriet Bowl had said on the porch after the fire. Langford's strategy depends on isolating people. 3 ranchers at her kitchen table in December, with Poole's wire and the Collier documents and the first legal action that had any real chance of running the strategy into the ground. This was what the opposite of isolation looked like. It was not dramatic. It was 4 people drinking coffee and talking about risk in practical terms. That was how things actually changed, she'd found. Not in single moments of high drama, but in the accumulation of small, practical decisions made by people who were tired and worried and showed up anyway. January came, and with it the filing of Poole's emergency petition in the territorial court, which was reported in the Millhaven Courier in a brief article that was factual and dry, and that nonetheless caused a conversation in every kitchen and general store in the county, because the article named Rhett Collier and named the 4 properties in the amended filings and named Victor Langford as the connecting party, and that information, once out, was not going back in. The Dry Hollow response was complicated. Some people, Mrs. Pierce among them, Mabel heard from Harriet, whose information network was formidable, maintained that the filing proved nothing and was simply Elias Hawthorne causing trouble he couldn't back up. Others, particularly those who had been in the fire line in December, and who had come back to Iron Creek since with the specific social warmth of people who had been through something together, were readjusting their opinions with the uncomfortable speed of the publicly corrected. And Vivian Langford came to the ranch. She arrived on a Thursday in mid-January, unannounced, on a good horse, alone. She was 24 with her father's pale eyes and her mother's coloring, and she was, Mabel could see immediately, not what the rumors had made her. Not the pawn daughter of a scheming patriarch, not an ambitious social climber, not any of the shapes that second-hand information had given her. She was a young woman who looked like she'd been carrying something she hadn't agreed to carry, and who had arrived here because she'd decided she was done carrying it. Mabel was the one who let her in. Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around the kitchen with an expression Mabel couldn't entirely read, and then she looked at Mabel. "You're Miss Rowan," she said. "I am. My father has said a great deal about you. I've heard something about that." Vivian's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. None of it was accurate. I could tell when he was saying it. She paused. "Is Mr. Hawthorne here? He's in the barn. Do you want me to send for him?" "In a minute." She looked at Mabel steadily. "I want to say something to you first, if that's all right." Mabel gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit down." Vivian sat. She put her gloves on the table and pressed her palms flat against the wood for a moment, the gesture of someone collecting herself, and then she looked up. "My father's plan, the marriage arrangement, I never agreed to it," she said. "I want to be direct about that. He told people I was interested. I wasn't. I've met Elias Hawthorne exactly twice in my life, and the last time was 2 years ago at a territorial cattle meeting." She paused. "I know that probably doesn't matter much to you at this point." "It matters to know the truth of a thing," Mabel said. "I also know what my father has been doing legally." Vivian's voice was steady, but it was working at being steady, the effort visible underneath. "I found out about the Morrow family in Clearwater 6 weeks ago. I didn't know before. I want that clear." She paused. "I spoke to my father about it. The conversation was not productive." "What did you tell him?" Vivian looked at the table. "I told him I wouldn't be used as part of it, that if he pursued the legal action against Iron Creek, I would speak to the territorial authorities about what I knew regarding the Clearwater settlement." She paused. "He told me I was being naive and that I didn't understand how business worked." "What did you say to that?" "I said I understood it fine and I didn't want to." She lifted her eyes. "He's my father. I'm not here to destroy him, but I'm not going to be the cover story for what he does to people." She paused. "I thought Mr. Hawthorne should know where I stood, and I thought you should know." Mabel looked at her for a moment. At 24, Vivian Langford was making a choice that would cost her in ways she probably hadn't fully calculated yet. The friction with her father, the social consequences in a community where the Langford name carried weight, the possibility that none of it would matter if the legal case went badly anyway. She was making it anyway. "I'll get Elias," Mabel said. Vivian's visit lasted 2 hours. Mabel made lunch and soup and bread, the same quiet hospitality she extended to everyone in that kitchen, without adjustment for circumstance or implication. And she stayed in the kitchen while Elias and Vivian talked, not because she was monitoring the conversation, but because it was her kitchen and the bread needed watching, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. What she heard was 2 people speaking honestly to each other about a situation neither of them had created, and the particular relief that entered a conversation when everyone in it stopped performing and started just talking. Vivian had information about the Clearwater settlement that Poole didn't have yet, specifics about the timeline and the bank involvement that strengthened the fraud case considerably. She was willing to provide it in writing. She was willing, if it came to it, to testify. After she left, Elias stood in the kitchen with the look of a man reordering his understanding of several things at once. "She came here on her own," he said. "Yes." "Her father is going to—" "Yes," Mabel said. "He will." He was quiet. "That took something," he said finally. "It did." Mabel began clearing the lunch things. "Write it down while it's clear. What she told you. Send it to Poole tomorrow." He picked up a bowl and set it by the basin. The automatic helpfulness that had emerged over months, without either of them noting it. "The bakery order," he said, apparently switching subjects, though Mabel suspected it wasn't as much of a switch as it seemed. "The Morrison family, his wife sent a message last week. She wants to know if you do wedding orders." Mabel looked up. "Dan Morrison's oldest daughter is getting married in April," Elias said. "His wife asked me to ask you, apparently deciding that going through me was the right approach for some reason." He paused. "I told her I didn't make decisions about your business." "What did she say to that?" "She seemed surprised." A pause. "She said she'd contact you directly." Mabel thought about the April timeline, the capacity, what a wedding order for a family Morrison size would require. It was manageable. More than manageable. It was an expansion, the kind of expansion she'd been watching for. "I'll write to her," she said. The pie tin under her floor was not yet what it would eventually be, but it was more than it had been, and it was growing with the steady reliability of something properly tended, not dramatic, not sudden, just the accumulation that came from doing good work consistently and being, by slow degrees, seen for it. Outside, the January light was the flat white of late afternoon in winter, and the kitchen garden was buried under snow, and underneath the snow the lavender was waiting with the same stubborn patience it had shown all along. Not dead, not thriving, just holding on through the cold with the deep conviction that the season would change, because seasons always did, and that what had been planted carefully enough was worth waiting for. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for the second week of March, which gave the Montana winter exactly enough time to do its worst before the case was decided. And Montana's worst that February was considerable. 2 weeks of temperatures that froze the water in the pipes before morning, a blizzard that kept the ranch hands inside for 3 days, the herd losing 2 animals to the cold that nobody could have prevented, and Elias took hard anyway, the way he took every loss on the ranch, quietly and with the particular inward expression of a man keeping his own private accounting of things gone wrong. But the ranch held. The house held. The kitchen ran. Poole had filed the emergency petition in January, and the court had accepted it, which meant the 60-day banknote call was frozen pending the fraud investigation, which meant Iron Creek had survived the immediate crisis long enough to fight the larger one. This was not a victory. Poole was careful to say that more than once. In his letters and in person when Elias rode to Millhaven in February. But it was ground held, and ground held was what you needed when the fight was long. Vivian Langford had provided her written statement in late January. It had taken more courage than most people would have managed. Her father had not taken it quietly, and the social fracture it created in the Langford household was, by the accounts that filtered through Harriet Bowles' information network, severe and ongoing. Vivian had moved into the Millhaven Hotel for 6 weeks, which was not a comfortable position for a woman of her social standing in a territory where your family name was your primary currency. She had done it anyway. Mabel thought about her sometimes with a complicated respect. Not admiration of the easy kind, but the harder kind. The kind you felt for someone who paid a real price for doing the right thing and didn't get to feel clean about it because the cost was still running. Garrett Poole brought 3 additional cases to the court, along with Iron Creek's, the Morrow family's original Clearwater documentation, which he'd obtained through a contact in the Territorial Records Office. A deposition from a surveyor in Butte who had worked alongside Rhett Collier in the early 1880s and who had specific knowledge of how Collier's amended filings were structured, and a written account from Fletcher Aldermore, carefully prepared by his new lawyer, which outlined the fraudulent basis of his own settlement without technically reopening the settlement itself. Dan Morrison testified in person, which Mabel had not expected and which moved her more than she could have anticipated. This blocky, plain-spoken man who had no particular eloquence and who stood in the territorial courtroom in Millhaven in his good coat and told the court exactly what had happened with his eastern grazing boundary in the kind of flat, factual language that was more convincing than rhetoric precisely because it didn't try to be. He said what happened. He said what he'd lost. He said he was there because it had happened to other people too, and he thought the court should know it. Mabel was not in the courtroom. She had no standing to be there, and she understood that clearly. She waited at the Millhaven Hotel with June, who had insisted on coming and whom Elias had agreed to bring because June at 12 was the kind of person whose insistence on things was backed by a quality of seriousness that made refusing feel wrong. They sat in the hotel dining room and drank tea, and June read her book with the rigid concentration of someone using reading as a container for anxiety. And Mabel watched the street through the window and did not allow herself to speculate on outcomes because speculation was not useful, and she had learned a long time ago to spend her energy only on things that responded to it. Elias came back from the courthouse at 4 in the afternoon. He walked into the hotel dining room, and June looked up from her book, and Mabel looked at his face, and she could see it immediately. Not triumph. Elias wasn't built for triumph, but something that was the structural opposite of the look he'd worn when he sat down at her kitchen table in December with his coat still on and the weight of the banknote letter in his hands. That look had been the look of a man beginning to understand how small the space he was standing in had become. This was the look of someone who had found out the floor was going to hold. "We won," he said. June made a sound that was not quite a word. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table, and the control she usually applied to herself with such discipline slipped for just a moment, her eyes bright, her jaw working, and then she put it back in place with the effort that Mabel had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. The way some people held the most important things tightly, precisely because they mattered most. "The water rights?" Mabel asked. "Permanently upheld. The court found the 1874 survey amendment was fraudulently filed and ordered it struck from the county record." He sat down. He looked like he needed to sit down. "Collier is facing criminal charges. The court's finding applies to all 4 properties in the amended filings, which means Aldermore's settlement is void and Morrison's boundary dispute is resolved in his favor." He paused. Poole said he's never seen a territorial court move that decisively against a large operator. He said the Collier testimony was what did it. Having a witness who knew how the fraud was constructed, who could explain the mechanics of it to the court. And Langford? Elias was quiet for a moment. He wasn't in the courtroom. His lawyers were. The finding doesn't criminally implicate him directly. Poole says that's a separate proceeding, harder to prove, longer timeline. But his strategy is finished. The survey tool is gone. The bank connection, he paused. Poole filed a separate complaint with the Territorial Banking Authority about the circumstances of the note call. That's still pending, but the bank has already, apparently, decided they have no interest in being connected to what the court found today. The dining room was quiet around them. The afternoon light came through the window at a low winter angle, pale and clean. "The Morrow family," Mabel said. "Poole is filing on their behalf. He thinks they have a strong case for recovery of the land value differential. It won't be fast." He looked at her. "None of this is fast. It's not over. Langford still has money and lawyers, and he's not going to—" "I know," she said, "but the ground is different now." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yes," he said, "the ground is different." June had gone back to her book, or appeared to have. Mabel could see that she wasn't reading, just holding the book in front of herself while she processed what she'd heard, which was the June equivalent of open celebration. Mabel picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Spring came to Iron Creek in the particular way it came to Montana, grudgingly, incrementally, with setbacks, a warm week followed by a late frost that killed 2 things Mabel had put in the garden too early and that she took as a reminder not to get ahead of the season. But by April, the lavender was growing properly, and the kitchen garden was laid out in its full planned extent for the first time since Clara Hawthorne had planted it, and the Morrison wedding order was complete. 4 pies, 2 cakes, a quantity of dinner rolls that had required 3 days of baking, and delivered on a Saturday in the first warm week of the month. Ruth Morrison, Dan's wife, had paid the full price without negotiation, and had added, on the payment envelope, a note in her own handwriting. "Best we've eaten in this county. Tell me when you're taking regular orders." Mabel had read it twice, put it in the tin box under her floor with the money, and then stood at her window looking at the kitchen garden for a while. Not doing anything, just looking. The tin box was becoming something real. Not a bakery yet. She was clear-eyed about the distance between what she had and what that would require. But the direction was no longer theoretical. The Morrison wedding had brought 2 inquiries through Ruth's social network within the week. The Millhaven Hotel order had expanded to 8 pies weekly. There was a railroad station commissary in Ridgeline that had sent a letter asking about supply arrangements for their kitchen. Small things, but accumulating in the way that small things accumulated when you were consistent and the work was good. Elias knew the scope of it by now. She'd told him in March, straightforwardly, the way she told him most things, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the household accounts spread between them. He'd listened without interrupting. He'd asked 2 practical questions about the railroad inquiry, and then he'd said, with a slight effortful quality he had when he was saying something that mattered more than his tone was letting on, "You've been building this whole time." "I have, while everything else was happening." The one thing didn't prevent the other. She paused. "I wasn't going to put my life in suspension because the ranch had a difficult year." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you were." Something had been building in him, too. She knew that. She'd known it for months. You couldn't live in a house with a person, cook for them, sit in the same kitchen through winter evenings, go through a fire and a legal battle and a February blizzard and a court hearing without understanding quite a lot about them. She understood Elias Hawthorne in the way you understood something you'd spent a long time paying attention to. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the deep and specific way that mattered, the way that went past surface behavior into the underlying structure of how a person worked. She knew he was not a man who would say what he was beginning to feel until he was certain of it. That was not cowardice. It was the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that some doors, once opened, could not be closed, and who wanted to be sure of himself before he opened one. She respected that. She'd been applying the same deliberation herself. She was not Clara Hawthorne. She was not going to be Clara Hawthorne, and she would not have wanted to be. Clara had been real and specific and her own person, and the life she'd built here was real and specific too, still present in the kitchen garden and in June's way of holding herself and in the grief Elias still carried, quietly, the way you carried things that didn't leave but learned to fit alongside everything else. Mabel wasn't trying to replace what had been. She was trying to make something different, something that could exist alongside the past without pretending the past wasn't there. That, she thought, was the only honest version of the future that was available to either of them. He asked her in May. Not formally, not on a knee with a rehearsed speech, not in front of witnesses. He asked her in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning, which was a detail she would remember because she'd always felt Tuesday was an underrated day, ordinary in the way of most of the things that actually mattered. She was working on the ledger for the pie orders. She'd started a proper account book in April, a real one, not just the recipe book. And he came in from the yard, washed his hands at the basin, poured himself coffee, and stood at the work table for a moment in the particular way he stood when he was deciding whether to say something. She waited. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for about 3 months," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew. You've been circling something since February. I wasn't sure what you were waiting for. I was waiting to be certain. Are you certain now?" He looked at her steadily. The tired eyes, not as tired as they'd been in July, the good face with the gray coming in early at the temples. The man who had spent 3 years making himself smaller and was now, incrementally, in the process of making himself larger again. "I am," he said. "I want you to stay. Not in the way things have been." He paused. "I want to marry you, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the girl who had walked 6 miles with 43 cents and been laughed at on the road, and knocked on a stuck gate, and met an 8-year-old who told her she was big, and a 12-year-old who told her she wouldn't be friendly right away. She thought about the kitchen garden, and the lavender, and the pie tin under the floor, and the surveyor filings in Butte, and the fire, and the long evenings in the warm kitchen that had become, without her ever quite deciding on it, the thing she came home to. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what was safe, not what made sense from the outside looking in, what she actually wanted, for herself, the specific woman who had walked that road. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for some time. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, with the slightly awkward warmth of a man who was still finding his way back to being a person who could say warm things, I'm glad. So am I. He drank his coffee. She went back to the ledger. The kitchen was ordinary and familiar around them, and outside the kitchen garden was in its full spring growth, and the lavender was doing well. Quote, the wedding was in June, small by necessity and by preference. Both of them were people who found large social occasions more effortful than meaningful, and the community's relationship with Mabel had shifted, but not so completely that a large public event wouldn't have had edges in it. But the people who came were the right people. Harriet Bowl, who had brought supplies to the fire line and sat on the porch step and told the truth plainly. Fletcher Aldermore, whose settlement had been voided and whose eastern boundary had been restored, and who arrived with a quieter manner than the December visit, the manner of someone who had been carrying something heavy and had recently put it down. Dan Morrison and his wife Ruth, who brought food because Ruth Morrison was constitutionally unable to attend any event without bringing food, which Mabel understood completely and appreciated. Cole and Davis and Wakely, who cleaned up for the occasion with varying degrees of success and who stood at the edge of the yard with the self-conscious dignity of working men at a social occasion. Poole came from Mill Haven because Elias had asked him and because Poole had understood, in the way of a man who had spent 40 years watching what happened to people in a territory, that what had happened at Iron Creek was worth witnessing. Vivian Langford sent a letter and did not come, which was the right decision and which Mabel understood. Vivian was still in the process of building a life that was separate from her father's, which was slow work, the kind that required all your attention and didn't leave much for other people's occasions. The letter was brief and honest, and Mabel kept it. June wore her good dress and spent most of the day looking like she was working hard to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding, which was the most openly emotional Mabel had ever seen her, and which she found, privately, more affecting than anything else about the day. June was 13 now, and the 13 had not softened the quality she'd had at 12. The seriousness, the precision, the way she held things carefully, but it had added something to it, a slight opening, the way a door that's been stuck begins to move after the season changes and the wood settles differently. Elsie had opinions about everything and expressed all of them. She'd asked in April, when it became clear that things were moving toward this, "Does this mean you're our mother now?" Mabel had thought about that carefully before answering. "I'm going to be your father's wife," she'd said, "and I'm going to be here. What that means for the rest of it, that's something we can figure out as we go. There's no rush." Elsie had considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "My mother was good," she said. "I don't remember everything about her, but I remember she smelled like lavender." "I know," Mabel said. "You grew the lavender back." "It was already there. I just cleared what was on top of it." Elsie had thought about that for a moment longer. "Okay," she said, with the decisiveness of an 8-year-old who had finished an internal deliberation. "I think that's okay." It wasn't resolution. Nothing was that clean or that complete. Clara Hawthorne was still in that house, in the bones of the kitchen garden, in June's way of looking at things, in the small framed portrait on the office wall that nobody moved and nobody talked about, and that simply existed as what it was, a woman who had lived there and planted things and raised daughters, and was still, in the ways that mattered, present. Mabel was not in competition with her memory. She understood that the love a family held for someone who was gone did not diminish to make room for someone new. It simply expanded, stretched, became large enough to hold both things at once, which was one of the more remarkable capacities of the human arrangement. She was not a perfect person taking over a perfect household. She had a temper she managed with effort, a tendency toward bluntness that occasionally landed harder than she intended, a stubbornness that had served her well and had sometimes made things more difficult than they needed to be. She was still learning the particular rhythms of the ranch, the specific demands of the herd in summer, the things Elias didn't say aloud that she had to read from how he held his shoulders on difficult days. She would make mistakes she hadn't made yet. That was not pessimism. It was just honesty about how things worked. But the kitchen garden was growing. That was the thing she came back to when she thought about what the year had been and what it meant. Not the legal victory, not the business beginning to take shape, not even the wedding. The garden. Claire had planted it with knowledge and care, and then it had been left and it had nearly died. And Mabel had found it half buried under 3 years of neglect, and pulled the weeds off it and broken up the compacted soil and given it water and let it be what it already was. She hadn't built it. She'd restored it. And the restoration had taken longer than it should have and had gone wrong in several places and was still not complete. There was a bed in the northeast corner that she hadn't figured out yet, and the drainage on the west side needed work before fall, and she'd lost the early plantings in March to that late frost and had to start again. It was not a triumph. It was just a garden, alive and imperfect and continuing. That was enough. That had always been enough. The work she'd come to do was not the work she'd thought she was coming to do. She'd come to cook and manage a kitchen, and she'd ended up doing that and also pulling a family back from the particular kind of dissolution that grief could cause if it went unaddressed long enough. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't performed it. She'd just paid attention and done what the situation required, which was all she'd ever known how to do, and which she'd learned over this year was not a small thing. You couldn't force a family back together. You couldn't argue someone out of grief or shame a community into fairness, or legislate a corrupt man into honesty. What you could do was make the kitchen warm and the food good and the table set for 4, and keep showing up, and let the accumulation of that do its slow and unremarkable and absolutely essential work. She thought about her mother sometimes in the evenings, Ruth Rowan, who had done what she could, and whose handwritten recipes had traveled in an oilcloth parcel from Dry Hollow to Iron Creek Ranch and were now annotated in 2 different hands. Mabel's additions layered over her mother's original instructions, the way the present layered over the past, changing it and being changed by it. The pie tin under the floor had been replaced by a proper account ledger in the kitchen drawer. The money it represented was not yet a bakery, but it was headed there steadily, the way money headed somewhere when it was accumulating with purpose. By her own calculation, she'd be ready to file the papers on a proper commercial kitchen within 2 years, maybe less if the railroad commissary order came through. It would be hers, fully, separate from the ranch, not in opposition to Iron Creek, but alongside it, the way 2 growing things could share the same ground without competing for it. The woman who had arrived with 43 cents had not become rich or famous or finally vindicated in some public ceremony of acknowledgement. She had become something more durable than any of that. She had become necessary, not in the way that kept her small, not in the way of someone whose value depended on other people's need, but in the way that meant she had put herself into things that mattered, and the things had held and she had held, and between her and them, something had been built that could stand up to fire and legal fraud, and Montana winters, and the long grinding weight of other people's doubt. That was the life. Not the story of it. The life itself, continuing, unresolved in all the ways lives were unresolved, full of the work that never finished, and the people who didn't stop being complicated, and the garden that needed attention every season without exception. The lavender was in full bloom by June. The whole south end of the kitchen garden smelled of it on warm afternoons, and Elsie, who remembered what her mother had smelled like, would sometimes walk through it slowly on her way in from the yard, trailing her hand through the flowers without saying anything. And Mabel would watch through the kitchen window and not comment, because some things were private and should stay that way, and because the lavender was doing what lavender did, which was simply to be present and to persist and to fill the air around it with something good. That seemed on the whole like the right kind of legacy for anything.